Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the latest episode of the Film Stories podcast. Can you believe this is episode 296?
Flippin' heck.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, well, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and appreciation. It's really, really, really hard to make a film, and me just being thankful that films somehow get made. I'm going to move straight into this episode anyway. Well, that's far too much preamble, and get on with the first of the two films I want to talk about. As always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer from the movie, and I'll come to the story of this one, the other side of this.
Constable Ichabod Crane, sent from New York to investigate murder in Sleepy Hollow.
How much of your superiors explained to you?
Only that the three were slain in open ground, their heads severed from their bodies.
Taken by the headless horseman, taken back to hell.
He rode a giant black steed. To look at him made your blood run cold. Even today, the Western Woods is a haunted place where brave men will not venture.
We have murders in New York without benefit of ghouls and goblins.
You're a long way from New York, Constable.
And that's a clip from the trailer for 1999 Sleepy Hollow, directed by Tim Burton, screenplay by Andrew Kevin Walker, the story credited to Andrew Kevin Walker and Kevin Yeager, based on Washington Irving's book, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, wouldn't you know it? Cast for this one led by Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci, Miranda Richardson, Michael Gambon, Casper Van Dien and Jeffrey Jones. And the story of it, well, let's go all the way back to 1994. And I'm indebted, I should say up front, I'm indebted to Mark Salisbury's excellent book. Whenever I come to a Tim Burton story, his excellent book Burton on Burton for really a foundation for this particular episode. And it's in that book that I learned that back in 1994, a makeup effects designer at the time by the name of Kevin Yeager was on the lookout for something new. He was looking for a project to explore. He'd ventured into directing by this stage as well. He'd worked on the Tales from the Crypt TV show, and he was drawn to the short story The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this one, Washington Irving's famous story dates all the way back to 1820, and it had proved fodder for screen work before, and notably the Disney animation The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was part based on Sleepy Hollow. Bing Crosby did the narration for that one. There was a television project that involved Jeff Goldblum as well. But with this particular approach, Yeager was soon put in touch with a then up-and-coming writer by the name of Andrew Kevin Walker. Now, Walker's script for the film Seven had been put together at that point, but the script hadn't been sold and the film hadn't been made, but that was very much the one that was going to put him on the map. But at this stage, he was hardly racking up a massive list of credits, and so some early development work was getting underway. What's more too, it looked like this was going to happen relatively quickly, that in precious little time really, the project came to the attention of producer Scott Rudin. Now, Scott Rudin bought that project on spec, and he engaged Paramount Pictures with it. And at this stage, the idea was that Yeager would direct the film. It would be a low-budget horror, and as such, it wouldn't cost an awful lot of money to do, and it should have got through the system relatively quickly at that point. That said, it didn't. That Yeager, while he was is tremendously skilled in makeup. I mean, he's the person you've got to thank for Freddy Krueger, amongst other on-screen creations. It wasn't getting on particularly well with Paramount, and whilst he would remain involved in the film, he wouldn't be directing the ultimate movie. He would end up doing prosthetic makeup work on it. And so while there was a script for the film in place that was co-written by Walker and Yeager, it just sat on the Hollywood stove for some time. That in the early stages of the 1990s, horror wasn't a big thing in Hollywood. It's a genre that comes in and out of trend. It seems to have been in trend at the time. This has been recorded for quite a long time. But in the early 1990s, Hollywood studios weren't necessarily buying it. Paramount had the option on the film. Scott Rudin remained involved, but there was no sign of a director. And it took several years, really, before the project would take another jump forward. So let's move over to director Tim Burton then, because he was having a few battles of his own. Not least, he was lacking a box office hit. He never struck me as a man who desperately tries to seek a box office hit. But after 1992's Batman Returns, which itself underperformed on 1989's Batman, he had gone smaller with the film Ed Wood that I've covered before on a previous episode of this podcast. He would, of course, create and produce The Nightmare Before Christmas, directed by Henry Selick. But he was he came very close to making a couple of other films that would have taken him down slightly different routes. One of which was the very horror-tinged Mary Riley movie that was set up at Columbia. Now, in the end, that would get directed by Stephen Frears, who's briefly talked about it in a special episode of this podcast, if you go dig back into the archive. Burton was on it for a while, dropped off and decided to do Ed Wood instead. And Ed Wood, lots of acclaim, precious little box office at the end of it all. And he jumped back into blockbuster cinema with the delightful Mars Attacks. But Mars Attacks, through a consequence of timing really, followed Independence Day into cinemas several months afterwards, and it paid a price for that. That Independence Day played things slightly straighter and cleaned up. Mars Attacks played it for comedy and didn't clean up. So then Burton was lured back to superhero cinema. And back at Warner Brothers as well. Famously, he was attached to direct Superman Lives for a good year or so. He was attached to that project. He cast Nicolas Cage as the Man of Steel. There's a documentary film that looks at some of the footage of the test footage of Cage as Superman that tells the story, the death of Superman Lives. It's really worth digging out. But the Superman Lives for Burton at least got some way down the tracks before, infamously, the whole shebang came to an end. And we got to the point of around the summer of 1998 where Burton had put basically a year of energy into a film that didn't get made. And he described that whole experience to Entertainment Weekly magazine as, quote, extremely painful. And he said, I was pretty shell-shocked by the whole situation. What he was certainly keen to do was to get making a film again. Burton has said in several interviews across several films that his happy place is actually on the set shooting a movie, that's where he feels more at home. However, he was still picky just because he was looking to select a project and was now available, as again he would tell Entertainment Weekly. I didn't want to make any old piece of crap, he said, just to move on. He says, I didn't want to be like, okay, I'll do Police Academy 8 because I need the work. Well, obviously anyone who takes Police Academy 8 is doing it for the art, I'd suggest. And this is where Scott Rudin, the producer Scott Rudin, who at the time of this recording is still under a cloud of bullying allegations, I should note, but he saw his chance at this point, and working with his co-producer Adam Schroeder, he got the Sleepy Hollow screenplay to Tim Burton. Now, Tim Burton, his eyes looked at this, and by the sounds of it, they lit up. That he danced around doing horror projects in the past. I mean, there's horror tinges to certainly Batman Returns. There's horror tinges to Edward Scissorhands, to Nightmare Before Christmas, but he never really gone directly towards it. Mary Riley perhaps was as close as he got to a full-on horror film, and he liked what he was reading of Sleepy Hollow. He was familiar with the original story. He liked the visuals as well that the screenplay was conjuring up. He was drawn to the sly humour in the script as well. And he was interested. And also, as he told American Cinematographer magazine in an interview, he saw something here of the Hammer horror films that he'd grown up loving too. He would also add that he was inspired by Murray Bava's 1960s horror Black Sunday on top of that as well. And this is the point where the Sleepy Hollow story accelerates at great speed. Burton decided, yeah, I'm in. This is the project I want to do. And he would sign on the dotted line. He still felt there was some work to be done on the screenplay, that he would work with Andrew Kevin Walker on doing some rewrite work as well. And it was Scott Rudin who suggested bringing in the acclaimed writer Tom Stoppard to come in and do some rewriting of the script as well. And then it was a case of casting. And so it's not a massive surprise. I mean, if you look through the back catalogue of Tim Burton movies, Johnny Depp tends to be towards the top of the casting wish list for them. This was no different, that Burton was inclined to cast Depp. Paramount was happily keen as well, although was suggesting other options without outright declining Johnny Depp as a lead. Now, Depp liked the idea too of taking the character on. He thought about playing the Ichabod Crane with a long prosthetic nose and elongated fingers as well, and massive ears. And Paramount was less happy with that, because this was now no longer going to be a low-budget horror film. This was going to be a much richer production, and was going to come out more blockbuster tinged than the original vision for the story all the way back at the start in the 1990s, that particular version of the film. And so Depp was dissuaded from that, and it was the Tom Stoppard rewrites that helped persuade Depp, that helped lead him towards the film, really, that Stoppard's polish beefed up the romantic side of the character as well. And again, he was happy to sign on the dotted line once Paramount too had agreed the choice for the lead. The other candidates who were in the mix, I mean, in July 1998, Entertainment Weekly in a separate piece was reporting that Brad Pitt was in consideration. Liam Neeson was up for the lead as well. Daniel Day-Lewis popped up in the trade press as a consideration too. And it was Brad Pitt's agency who declared to Entertainment Weekly that he'd been offered the role of Ichabod Crane in Sleepy Hollow. However, Andrew Kevin Walker also told the outlet that the role was really kind of the ultimate wimp / hero. He described the lead here as brainy and physically delicate, with more in common with Rowan Atkinson than with a Mr. Stallone or a Mr. Schwarzenegger. With shooting being lined up for the end of 1998 at that point, when, partly because that's when foliage is at its peak, I know certainly mine is towards the end of the year, then this was coming together at relative speed, and Burton was winning the argument as to who to cast in the lead. That Pitt had a meeting about it. Johnny Depp would ultimately take the role on, and then Christina Ricci would come in cast in the female lead role. Now, Ricci, of course, had come to prominence playing Wednesday Addams as a young performer in the two Addams Family movies for Paramount earlier in that particular decade. She'd done some independent movies. I mean, The Opposite of Sex is well worth digging out, and was slowly building up her body of work at this stage. She's one of the few who's successfully making the transition from a child actor to an adult actor, and Sleepy Hollow would be the first time she would take a lead role in a studio blockbuster as well as an adult actor. Now, Burton saw the Hammer horror influences all over this, and thus a call went in to Christopher Lee, who duly accepted a role in the movie. Also, it was decided in the end that this was going to shoot in the UK, and that wasn't always the case, but that had, I'll come to that in a second, but that had some influence on the casting as well. So if you go down the ensemble for Sleepy Hollow, that you'll find some familiar British names in the midst of it all. I mean, have a look at Richard Griffiths in there as well, Miranda Richardson, you get Michael Gambon, Ian McDermott, Michael Gough reuniting with Burton after the Batman films as well. And also in comes Christopher Walken in a key role in the film. He's not British, but he's welcome wherever you seem to be shooting a film. The reason they ended up in Britain, what they considered for a while filming Sleepy Hollow in New York and leaning on location shoots in New York State. Burton, for one, was very, very keen at this stage to get out of Los Angeles. Not least, he'd spent a year there trying to make a film that didn't get made. And in the end, he decided to head to the UK, that they figured that they'd mix up soundstage work with locations there, with the idea that, well, they hoped to find a little town that wouldn't involve a lot of set dressing, and they'd just be able to shoot there. I mean, it's a nice idea, but in the end, what they decided they had to do was build most of the town that they were going to use in the film anyway. Still, they would do a chunk of location stuff in the UK, as well as some studio material. Burton was also really conscious that, I mean, with his beloved Hammer films, he always said that you could tell the difference between the stuff they'd done on location and the stuff that they'd done on sets built on sound stages, and he was much, much keener to blur the lines there. And so that put extra pressure really on the production designers just to help make it look as seamless as possible. Now, filming on Sleepy Hollow would begin in the middle of November 1998. That Burton and his team would decamp there. His cinematographer on this one was Emanuel Lubezki, and the pair of them had storyboarded chunks of this particular film. But Burton admitted by this stage in his career that whilst he was storyboarding, he was leaning on the boards less and less. I mean, he always was fairly candid about it. He didn't describe himself as the best director of action, but also he was going a little bit more instinctive when he was on the set of his films. And the interviews he was giving around the making and certainly the release of Sleepy Hollow just sound like he enjoyed making this. That he admitted as well in Mark Salisbury's book that he was less focused on the workings of the movie business coming into this film than perhaps he ever had been. That he was concentrating on making his movie and not the politics and machinations of Hollywood studios. He'd certainly sounded like he'd had his fill of those, although more of that was going to come after this project when he decided to tackle Planet of the Apes for Fox. Whole film story for another time, that one. There had been a consideration very early on between Emanuel Lubezki and Tim Burton about shooting in black and white and perhaps even shooting in the Academy ratio. Now, that really would hark back to the Hammer horror films, but Paramount was committing a fair amount of change to the film. It had budgeted around $70 million to make the movie, and $70 million, there's no way you're having it in black and white, and there's certainly no way you're having it in the Academy ratio either, so neither of those proved to be an option. But they were quite stylistic in the way that they shot the film, that notwithstanding, that they used a kind of monochromatic effect. If you look at the colour palette of Sleepy Hollow, it's very, very stylised, and they did just try and give it a slight timeless quality by the way they shot the film. Now, Entertainment Weekly again went to the set of this one and detailed how at Soundstage H at Shepperton Studios just north of London, the Hudson River Forest in 1799 had been rebuilt on that particular soundstage. Moving back to London to shoot this meant that Burton was reunited with some of his old crew from 1989's Batman, of course, and the report that Entertainment Weekly put, it just describes how on this soundstage they got not just trees, but quote, Tim Burton trees. I don't know what Tim Burton trees are, but let's just say that they probably lean more towards the spooky. The set report noted that there was a fair amount of fake blood and human heads here too, and that pointed to the fact that a decision was made very early on. There was no way this was going to pander for a PG-13 and a family-friendly rating. They were going to go all bloody and grisly and horrible and going to have an awful lot of fun doing it. Not everything could be achieved on that soundstage at Shepperton Studios, though. In fact, they went to a couple of other places. They did a month-long location shoot at Lime Tree Valley, for instance. That's located on the Hambledon Estate, which is in Buckinghamshire in the UK. And they also went up to Leavesden Studios. Now, Leavesden is an interesting creation of the 1990s British film industry. It came about when the Bond producers were looking for somewhere to shoot 1995's Goldeneye and effectively created a studio to do so. This was a point where it wasn't owned by Warner Brothers, which it is now, or Warner Brothers was only just coming in, and so other studios were still filming their movies there. Paramount was able to book Leavesden, but also, crucially for Burton's liking, was able to construct standing sets that, as soon as they got the shots in the can, those sets didn't have to instantly come down. And what Burton and his crew were shooting there were horse chases and such like. The way that he was approaching this, it was a fairly tight turnaround on Sleepy Hollow in the end. Burton was working with his regular editor, Chris Lebenson, and Lebenson was editing the action sequences even while the production was ongoing. Now, what this meant was Burton was able to review the edited sequences, and because the sets were still up, when he had bits and bobs that were missing, he could just simply go out, he could go back out and get a bit more footage on the fly. The flight shed that they used in Leavesden for shooting some of these horse sequences was quite long and narrow. It didn't actually give the horses an awful lot of room either. And again, go to the final movie, there are a lot of horses going very fast. And timing was absolutely crucial for this. There were loads and loads of moving parts, some of them animal parts, that sounds dodgy, for the action sequences in the film. And each setup that they were doing, each time they were doing a run of some of these sequences, was giving them about 2 to 3 seconds of actual usable material. they were still using a lot of physical tricks as well. This was something Burton was really, really keen on. For instance, they were using false perspective sets in places. They went as physical as they could here, so that not just to minimise the amount of post-production CG work on it, but also this is Burton again harking back to the films that influenced him, the ones that were done for real in front of a camera. That's what he wanted to capture. And then for Depp as well, it's worth noting that he said for his interpretation of Ichabod Crane, he was taking inspiration from an unlikely source, the late great Angela Lansbury. In particular, her performance in an adaptation of Death on the Nile. There's not much I can add to that, I just thought you'd like to know. And the relatively extensive physical shoot of Sleepy Hollow would ultimately wrap up around April of 1999. This one had gone on for quite a while, but also because so much of it had been done in camera, that meant there was going to be a truncated post-production on this particular film. In fact, Paramount had earmarked the film for release in November 1999, so Burton only had really about 6 months to hammer down his final cut of it, before the prince had to be struck and off it went to cinemas. Now, at the point Burton was making his film, and certainly when he was putting the final cut of it together, wouldn't you know it, there was a sudden influx of adaptations of Washington Irving's story. So, for instance, Fox had put together a 3D television film called The Night of the Headless Horseman. This had been rushed into production. That was going to land around the same time. Odyssey and Hallmark had come together for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This was a fairly economic production as well that was going to ride on the coattails of what Burton was up to. And then, of course, there was arguably the riskiest venture of them all, which was Tim Burton's film here. And it's worth digging into why it was a bit of a risk, because in 1999, Johnny Depp was not box office gold. His Pirates of the Caribbean days were not quite with us at this point. And Christina Ricci, I mean, she was the co-star and she'd hit big in indie films, but not hit big in a financial sense. It's more her performances had generated acclaim for her work. However, she hadn't had a massive box office hit that you could attribute really to her name. And then for Burton himself, well, it had been a long time really since he'd had what you could call a flat-out hit. That Mars Attacks had been a rare commercial disappointment for him. And Batman Returns, I mean, going back to that, it had under-delivered on what Warner Brothers was after, as much as its acclaim now, and as much as it was still a massive hit at the time. The thing for Burton is Batman had set a benchmark, really, for what studios were expecting from him, and who could really meet that kind of benchmark. And so, coming into the release of Sleepy Hollow, I mean, no one quite knew what Paramount had on its hands. Burton also didn't quite know who was involved. I mean, the story is told that he was sent a copy of the trailer for Sleepy Hollow that Paramount had cut together, and he discovered that amongst the executive producers on this was, well, wouldn't you know it, Francis Ford Coppola. Burton had absolutely no idea until he saw the trailer. And going back to Mark Salisbury's book, he explains in there that Coppola hadn't been involved at all, but it was Chris LeBenson who explained that Coppola probably made a phone call back in the 1970s, and it often happens that way, and as a result got some kind of residual credit on the film. Burton would say, I remember on Batman, I never even met the executive producers. You spend a year or two working on something, and then the main credits come up, and you go, who the cluck is that guy, said Burton. Burton wanted the truncated post-production that he'd got on Sleepy Hollow. He'd had to spend a lot of time wrestling the visual effects of Mars Attacks, which he'd originally intended to do with stop-frame animation, and had been persuaded to move towards CG for the creations of his Martians. But still, the film was ready. It was ready for its premiere on November the 17th, 1999, and the initial reception to it was pretty good. I mean, it wasn't off-the-chart huge acclaim for the film, but a lot of fun. The visual design of the film came in for a lot of praise as well, and there was a sense that Tim Burton was to a degree on home territory, that the world was terrific, that the film was fun to watch and great to look at as well. Was it Burton's best film? Not massively so, but still, it was, as much as some of the storytelling came in for some degree of criticism, it was generally regarded positively. In fact, the Academy Awards would go on to give it an Oscar for its art direction. It was also nominated for its cinematography and costume design as well, and that's where the bulk of the acclaim went for Sleepy Hollow, the actual look of it and the world creation of it and the production design of it. Would that translate into box office gold? Well, Paramount crossed its fingers, launched the film into cinemas in November of 1999, programmed it against the James Bond movie The World Is Not Enough, and Sleepy Hollow came up in second place on its opening weekend with a $30 million opening. That's good. That was good money. Paramount was happy with an R-rated horror doing that kind of money. In fact, the Bond film had only beaten it by $5 million. The World Is Not Enough, with Dr. Christmas Jones, remember, $35 million to its name. The previous week's number one was quickly dethroned. That was Pokemon, the first movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back. That was a sensation. There's a whole story around that film as well. Or other films in the top 10, well, you've got The Bone Collector, starring Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, a decent thriller, that. Kevin Smith's Dogma was in there. The Insider, which I covered before, was at number 7, struggling to bring much box office in, but very much worth digging out, that film. Chris O'Donnell vehicle, The Bachelor, wasn't doing great guns. Being John Malkovich snuck in 10th place. Sleepy Hollow, well, could it hold its business? Well, yeah. I mean, its second weekend, it did another 18 million. It just dropped 38%, which Paramount would have been thrilled with, not least because the competition the following week included Toy Story 2 being ramped up into a lot, loads and loads and loads of screens, smashing the top spot with 57 million. The Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle End of Days opened with 20 million as well, and that was kind of playing for the same audience of Sleepy Hollow as well. And Sleepy Hollow just hung around the following weeks. There wasn't an awful lot of competition going into December. The Green Mile came along a few weeks later and did decent money. Stuart Little, Bicentennial Man, Anna and the King, they were around the middle of December, but nothing that would be drawing an audience away from Burton's film. And in the end, Sleepy Hollow just crept over 100 million in the US, $101 million, another $105 million outside of America. Total gross $206 million for an R-rated horror film, and it was a hit. Burton had got the hit that he needed. I don't think he was necessarily massively hunting for a hit, but the film had gone down well. Audiences had turned up to see it, and he got a film made after a year of what you could say was a fair amount of problems in just trying to get his Superman project off the ground. No sign of a sequel or anything, though. No sign of any kind of spin-off. For Burton, he was firmly back in the realm of blockbuster filmmaking after this. He took the call from 20th Century Fox. He agreed to make Planet of the Apes, but as I said, I'm going to come to that one in a future episode of the podcast. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. So as always, I'm going to do just a couple of parish notices here. I mean, if you like this podcast, if you enjoy this podcast, I mean, thank you. There are 3 ways that you can support it. If you want to support it financially, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put some money in the pot there, well, in return, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You certainly get it ad-free as well. You find out gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes too. Costing you absolutely nothing is just subscribing at your podcast host of choice. That really helps independent podcasts and plays with algorithms and all sorts of complicated things, as does leaving ideally a hugely positive review. And I'm hugely grateful to everyone who's supported the podcast this way. In fact, I'm hugely grateful to anyone who even tolerates and listens to it. But if you can do any of those things, that's massively appreciated. Elsewhere, we also do Film Stories print magazines. We've got new issues of Film Stories and of Film Junior. Film Stories issue 40 goes behind the scenes of the folk horror Unwelcome. Film Junior has a massive look ahead at the films of the next 12 months, as well as interviews, filmmaking advice, and articles written by film fans under 15. You can find those magazines for sale at our online store, which is shop.filmstories.co.uk. And I have 2 live shows coming up. I'm in London on Thursday, the 23rd of February 2023 at King's Place, and I'm at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham on Wednesday, March the 29th. If you go to filmstories.co.uk, have a look at the live events tab at the top of the screen. You'll find all the ticket details and information there. But that's enough parish notices. I want to get on with the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. Again, let me tee this one up, little gag, with a little clip from the trailer of the film concerned. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
I didn't choose golf. It more it chose me. It was destiny. Sorry! Flippin' heck. Where I come from, the only job was the shipyard. But I did have ambitions, of course. If you could do anything in the whole world, what would you do?
Drink Guinness.
pretty soon. My own dreams were put on hold.
Stop this stupid dancing near the TV.
It's not stupid.
Because I had a family now.
Shut it!
A new young man once said he was going to be somebody.
I promised champagne, caviar, diamonds. You should have married him. Then, well, everything changed.
And he's done it. It just goes to show if you put your mind to it, you can achieve anything you want to.
I'm going to have a crack at the British Open.
Golf.
So here's a film you'll find barely anywhere in the awards season that this is being recorded in the midst of. But what an oversight. It is The Phantom of the Open, directed by Craig Roberts, written by Simon Farnaby, and based on the book that he co-authored with Scott Murray, The Phantom of the Open, Maurice Flitcroft, the world's worst golfer. The cast of the film: Mark Rylance, Sally Hawkins, Rhys Ifans, Jake Davis, Christian Lees, Jonah Lees, Mark Lewis-Jones and Johann Myers. Farnaby also turns up in a small role in the film. But the story does go back to Simon Farnaby. He's a name who's popped up before on this podcast. I did an interview in conversation with Special for him around the cinematic release, The Phantom of the Open. But also we turned up when we discussed the hugely underrated British family movie, Bill. Now, Farnaby, you'll see, as one of the the key six creatives behind shows like the brilliant Yonderland, the first run of Horrible Histories, and the huge, sensational and wonderful comedy Ghosts as well. He's written and performed in both. He's co-written Paddington 2. He did some work on the original Paddington as well. Worked on Mindhorn, that was one of his. But growing up, I mean, his life was far away from the world of screen. His dad was a greenkeeper for a golf course, and thus Farnaby was raised in and around the sport of golf, to the point where he became close to becoming a professional golfer at one stage. And that's when he first heard the story of a man called Maurice Flitcroft. Now, Flitcroft is regarded as, inverted quotes, if you like, the world's worst golfer. I'm always a bit wary of stuff like that. But his story is famous because he entered the British Open golf tournament in the 1970s in spite of never really having played the game. And he got, without spoiling the story, some progress in his quest to be part of that tournament. Now, Farnaby started building his career with comedy shows, burgeoning television work as well. But, I mean, the key turning point for this project was the book that was published all the way back in 2010. Now, it went by the name of The Phantom of the Open, Maurice Flitcroft, the world's worst golfer. But the book wasn't Farnaby's first piece of writing on this, because he'd actually penned a screenplay for it before the book. But the eventual screenplay for the movie itself wasn't the one that Farnaby wrote all that time back. So if you're just about following this. Because in the late 2000s, Farnaby had told a producer called Tom Miller about the story of Maurice Flitcroft, and they'd made a couple of research trips to Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria here in the UK, where Flitcroft lived and where Maurice's friends and surviving family were still living. And so they met up with them and they dug into the Maurice Flitcroft story. And on one of those trips, they brought along a journalist by the name of Scott Murray, and between them all, they had a collective desire to tell the Flitcroft story properly. As Farnaby would tell Cineworld in an interview, we got hold of his unpublished autobiography, which informed a lot of the book. And Maurice Flitcroft had called his memoir The Phantom of the Open. And Farnaby, as such, said as was a tribute to him, really. And he said there's an important bit in his autobiography where he says he was evacuated during World War II as a kid. And he went to stay with a very well-to-do family. And they had a totally different philosophy. They had money and were like, you can be whatever you want to be, young Maurice. So what is that? And at that point, Flitcroft in his life learned violin and languages and such like. But there was a degree of that ethos that was instilled into him. Now, I talked to Farnaby about really just getting the tone of this film right and what inspired him to make the film. And so rather than me recount his words, here's a bit of Simon Farnaby.
Certainly in the case with Maurice, it's a sort of respect for his choices, what he decided to do. I really sort of, the reason I love him is because you sort of laugh at what he tried to do. And then when I dug into it and I spoke to everyone involved, you know, everyone who knew Maurice. Yeah. And it was really crucial to me that what he did came from a place of sort of innocence, if you like, or sincerity, and which he did, thankfully. What I dreaded was people going, oh, he was just joking. He was just messing around, and he knew it was. But no, he was deadly serious. He thought he was good enough. He thought he could do it. So from there, you have to respect that character of that person, and what he's, in his life choices, as absolutely insane as they seem to most people.
And that was really important throughout the various iterations of the story that Farnaby built, that this was not going to be a story that laughed at Maurice Flitcroft. We'd seen a little bit of this with the Eddie the Eagle story that I've covered before on this podcast, that Dexter Fletcher successfully brought to the big screen with Taron Egerton in the lead role. It's a terrific film, that. And I remember talking about Eddie the Eagle and suggesting there was a different version of that. In fact, during the development of Eddie the Eagle in its early stages, one particular script was a lot crueler to the character, and that's something that ultimately Eddie the Eagle, the movie, went nowhere near, but also Farnaby's take on the Maurice Flitcroft story went nowhere near as well. So Farnaby penned a script treatment at that point, and Murray wrote the story up initially for The Guardian, but they couldn't get any interest from the UK film industry around 2009, and so they pressed ahead with the book version instead, that was published in 2010. Now, in the aftermath of that, Farnaby built his career, and producer Miller set up a company called Water and Power Productions, and they both still retained an interest in the story, that Miller would option the book itself, and he got a little bit of money from the British Film Institute so that Farnaby could have another go at the screenplay for it. I mean, Farnaby, when he was doing interviews for the Phantom of the Opens release, was quite disparaging of the first script that he wrote. He wasn't a fan of it, and he'd worked with Paul King by the time he got to write the film again. Now, Paul King is the director and the co-writer of the Paddington movies, and Farnaby credits King with teaching him an awful lot about building stories and making the stories work for screen. And as Farnaby would describe to Yahoo in an interview, he said this could have been, in the end, a Ken Loach or a Mike Leigh kind of gritty working class story. It is that sort of story. But he explained, I always wanted it to be a bit more Billy Liar than Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. And he explained that he wrote a screenplay before he wrote the book, but then in the end he would write so many different versions of the screenplay. There were so many outrageous things that they didn't put in the final film. But with the BFI funding, Farnaby could set aside a bit of time and could complete a version of the screenplay that could start to lure in other companies. Those companies, and this was built as an independent film, and as such it generally takes a matrix of different funding pots to get a movie like this over the line. So in came Steve Coogan's production company, Baby Cow Productions, for instance. Coogan's links with the BBC were quite helpful. They got BBC Films involved. Next up was a company called Cornerstone Films, and Cornerstone's job was to sell the rights for distribution for the Phantom of the Open. Ingenious Media then completed the initial collection of companies that were coming together to make the film, and so there was a point really where this could now move forward. Now, originally the film wasn't taking the name of the book. It was going under the title when it was first being shopped around of The Fantastic Flitcrofts. Yet the plan here was now to take it to Cannes Film Festival to start putting together the packaging of rights really and the distribution. With that in mind, the casting and the director needed to come aboard as well. So casting, I'm going to mention the name Shaheen Baig here, and she is an absolute legend of British film casting who doesn't actually get an awful lot of mentions, but you look at the films she's cast and the young ensemble she's put together, and she's become a hugely influential figure in the British film and TV world. You just look at some of the stuff she's cast. The TV show Peaky Blinders is one of hers, for instance. More recently, films such as Ali and Ava. Everybody's talking about Jamie is on her list as well. How to Build a Girl, Fighter in My Family, Animals. And there's also so many examples of where she's uncovered brand new talent, really. There's, at the point this is being recorded, an upcoming film coming to UK cinemas by the name of Scrapper, and some of the casting in that is quite extraordinary. And so Shaheen Baig came in, and by June 2019 the film had scored really a quick coup by landing Mark Rylance. Now, Rylance, an Academy Award winner for Bridge of Spies, but one of the most respected stage actors currently working in Britain, was to take on the lead role of Maurice Flitcroft in this. But the suggestion seemed to have come from the person who was hired to direct the movie. Because let's now turn our attention to Craig Roberts. Roberts had burst into film off the back of his acting work in films such as The Brilliant Submarine, and he was in the midst of finishing off his second directorial effort, a film called Eternal Beauty, that would ultimately be released as strong, if divisive, reviews. And so he'd come through as an actor, and he was building his career as a director, but very much with the ethos that he was going to direct his own screenplays, that he wanted to be a writer-director rather than a director for hire. However, he would make an exception, much to his surprise really, when he got hold of the script for The Fantastic Flitcrafts, and he was immediately taken with it. And so I asked Roberts about this, and he explained to me in the full interviews on the Film Stories website. He said, I had a pretentious idea that I'd be an author that would write his own stuff, told you, and then that would be it. And he acknowledges, to be honest, it was silly. And he said, when I read Simon's script, number one, I loved how accessible and how commercial it was. It felt really big to me, even though it's a small story. It felt huge, and it felt like it could transcend the place it's in. And he just explained, I haven't really written anything like that before, and I don't know if I ever will. And so he would sign up as a director after being attached to and linked to it for a little while, because he described how he read the screenplay to this and just felt himself overwhelmed with excitement for it. He had a conversation with Simon Farnaby. They discovered tonally, and that was crucial, that they were on the same page for this. And Roberts put forward the idea of Mark Rylance take on the role of Flitcroft. And so when it came to approaching Rylance isn't an actor who, for whatever reason, has much of a pedigree in comedy. He's not known as someone you approach with a comedy. And so Roberts decided to write Mark Rylance a letter, and he also talked about the tone of the movie on the phone to him as well. And he described how he wanted Rylance to play it seriously, because that would then help make the comedy side of it sing. And even though he didn't talk to him directly about this particular reference, what Roberts had firmly in his mind was Robert De Niro's work in the film Meet the Parents, as a cast iron example really of how playing well against type could work. And as Roberts would explain, he grounds it and makes it real, and that's really what he was looking for with The Phantom of the Open as well. Roberts thus formally came aboard the project in May of 2020, with Rylance joining up the month after that. Maurice Flitcroft's son was also announced as being part of the team putting it together, used in a consultant role. And the rest of the cast was formally announced and slotted into place in October of 2020, which is when Sally Hawkins, who just worked with Roberts on Eternal Beauty, she joined up. Rhys Ifans was in there as well. And also by this stage, the distribution of the film was in some degree of shape as well, because filming would get underway in October 2020, and it was going to take a 6-week shoot that was going to be spread across London, Liverpool and Kent primarily. And we already knew at this point that Water and Power Productions was involved, and Baby Cow was involved as well. But just ahead of the start of filming, in came Entertainment One to snap up the distribution rights that would cover the UK and large parts of Europe as well. Now, Roberts, when it came to actually filming, would draw as an influence on the work of Paul Thomas Anderson for how to go about shooting certain sections of the film, because there was a fear really that a lot of this could be conversations with people just standing round, and also how do you make the sport of golf exciting? Well, you watched the film Tin Cup for a start, but how do you do that? And so, as Roberts explained to me, he was looking for, when he was looking at Boogie Nights, he was looking at the movement of the film and the way that the camera was constantly moving and the energy in that. And he described here that to facilitate the camera moves, plenty of track had to be laid down. And he would say a person standing in a green field can become very boring very quickly, and that the golf was a challenge. And he also looked at Steven Spielberg's film Catch Me If You Can, that I've also covered before on this podcast, and he talked about how films like that felt appropriate really. Move the camera as much as possible, go with the rhythm of the music, make it feel as kinetic as possible as well. And he was getting a lot of his golf shots in camera. I mean, there wasn't digital effects trickery going on here, so that took a degree of planning and perspective to make it all look as convincing as it did. When it came to the colour palette of the film as well, one of Roberts' initial reactions to reading Farnaby's script was, and by now the film was called The Phantom of the Open, but one of Roberts' initial reactions was it had a feel of the Christopher Reeve Superman films, primarily the first two Superman films, and so he wanted to reflect the colour palette of that a little bit in the way that he shot the film, the brightness of it. There are a couple of Superman Easter eggs you'll find in the midst of it all as well. Now, this being filmed in 2020, in the autumn of 2020, well, you don't need me to tell you what happened in 2020. This was at a point where film productions were getting back up and running again after a tumultuous time and lockdowns and such like, and so that restricted the conditions in which really that they could shoot the film. And it also put restrictions too when it came to post-production as well. Because after 6 weeks, once it had all wrapped up, well, by the end of 2020, Roberts was deep into the edit of The Phantom of the Open, along with his editor, Jonathan Amos. Now, the thing is, usually with a comedy film, you would get a fair few test screenings, even for a relatively low-budget comedy film such as this. I mean, there's no budget figure that's ever really been published for Phantom of the Open, but let's call it in the millions, but not a lot. And here, because of the assorted lockdowns starting and stopping, there wasn't really an opportunity to do a breadth of test screenings. In fact, as Roberts would explain to me, they only got one in the end that they could call on, and so for most of the edit and for the comedy of this, Roberts and his team were working on gut instinct, which is of course very hard when you're making a comedy movie, because by the time you're looking deep into the final edit, you've seen the same joke on screen 15 to 20 times, and so is it still fresh to you? Does it still work? Well, how can you possibly tell when you're that close to it? It is worth noting that Farnaby had written a script that was not laden with F-bombs. That's not really his style, as he explained to me. There is, in fact, one F-bomb in the film, which was edited for the trailer as well. So there was a second recording of that. And in fact, that's the clip I played right at the start of this podcast too. But it was very clear come the final edit of the film that this actually had the feel of a family comedy. And I don't want to spoil the film, short of to say it's one well worth stopping to the end. It doesn't quite go where I expected it to go. I found the final movie an absolute delight. Now, we couldn't actually see it because of the way lockdowns and cinema schedules were going, and I'd imagine this is one of the productions where there was some doubt about whether it would see the inside of a cinema at all. However, a premiere was scheduled for the London Film Festival on the 12th of October 2021, so just under a year after, well, around a year after it had started filming. And the response to the film when it landed, it wasn't one of the highest profile films at that year's London Film Festival, but it was a British film in the programme, so it did get a relatively prominent event, and the response to it was really strong for a couple of reasons. Number one, that it harnessed almost the tone and the qualities of the classic British Ealing comedies of old. It's also the story itself was dealt with in such a sensitive and upbeat way. That came in for praise as well. The slightly unusual story too. I mean, the review. And then there was Mark Rylance's performance in it. And the whole idea that he had playing this absolutely straight, whereas the rest of the film was really, really light. So they weren't flat out raised to the film, although there were a couple, in fairness, but the response to it was strong, and there was immediate interest in, well, just when is this actually going to be released? Well, it's an easier question to ask than it was to answer, because the release date was threatening to bounce around a little bit, and it didn't help that we went into 2022 off the back of more lockdowns and more COVID related things, which I'm not going to go into in great depth here. You know it all happened. So in the end, Entertainment One settled on a release of the 18th of March 2022 at a point where there was just uncertainty all around cinema, that there were films going in that just were doing no business whatsoever in spite of really strong reviews in some cases. And in fact, when The Phantom of the Open did finally land at the UK box office, well, its opening weekend number was, I mean, it was all right, but it wasn't particularly exceptional. And it was bizarrely, in spite of all the problems cinemas had been having finding films in the year before, it opened the same week as 16 other movies in the UK. And so I've got the UK box office chart for the weekend it came out, and The Phantom of the Open was in 5th place with just shy of £500,000. The Nan movie, which I will come to Toronto at some point had opened in 4th place with just a little above that. The Batman was the number 1 film. Jujutsu Kaisen 0 was doing well for Sony, which had decided to put the Japanese movie out in UK cinemas. Uncharted was still around as well. But The Phantom of the Open's box office just was not being reflective of the acclaim that the film itself had received. And in fact, the following week, it was down. RRR opened in UK cinemas, as well as Michael Bay's Ambulance. And by the time the movie left UK cinemas, it banked just over about £1 million. It had, by this stage, managed to secure US distribution, though, that Sony Pictures Classics came in July of 2021 with an offer. It picked up release in North America and a few other territories as well. But it would get a very, very narrow release in American cinemas. And, I mean, it's a tough sell, isn't it? A British golfing comedy with a kind of working class undercurrent about someone who wasn't very good at golf. It doesn't particularly make for a great poster. And so when Sony came to sell the film in the US, it went for lots and lots of star ratings and reviews and such like, but still it barely crawled to just shy of $750,000 in America. The worldwide box office for The Phantom of the Open is $4 million, and what's that, 2.5-3 million quid, something like that. And so a commercial success this was not. The hope with the film was that it might get some traction for awards season. It was put in for the likes of BAFTA consideration, but no dice there. And so this now sits as, I mean, it's one of the reasons I've covered it on this episode, a massively underseen, absolute family delight of a movie, that this is where we really find out if streaming services still have that power to take a little seen film and elevate it in a way that it deserves, because The Phantom of the Open is a film that absolutely deserves seeking out. It has been, a 12-13 year labour of love for Simon Farnaby just to get it to the screen in the first place, but also the fact that it's come out in such a positive state and such a breath of fresh air, and also so funny as well, is a real achievement and a half. If you take nothing else ever from another podcast that I do at least seek this one out. I do think it's a real delight. I think you might like it. And then an absolutely perfect double bill with another golfing favourite of mine, Kevin Costner in Tin Cup, the best rom-com of the 1990s. Which brings me to the end of this episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. On YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories, facebook.com/Film Stories online. The Film Stories website is filmstories.co.uk. That's where you find out news, reviews, features, events, mischief. Store.filmstories.co.uk is where you'll find our Blu-ray for sale of Sneakers. We've got more Blu-ray news hopefully coming later this year. You'll also find there our print magazines. We've got over 50 of them now, waiting to. We ship them all over the world. Thank you so much for everyone who supports us. And the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. For now, though, I'm going to leave you in peace. I think I've bored you for far too long. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. The main thing is you all stay safe and well. Catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.